Hello, BookTube. I did my 12.3K Q&A answer videos today. As usual, I broke them up into 30-minute segments, and it took 4 videos to do. It was a great deal of fun. I don't know where you people get all these great questions, but it was so much fun. But when I was done, I realized that if I set a self-imposed maximum videos of 5 in a given day, just so that I don't completely break the YouTube algorithm, that still leaves us 1 video. And how could that spot go to anything other than poetry? I've been reading you a poem a day all week long, and I've been loving how it feels. So I'm going to read you a poem today. Now, the anthology that I'm going for this time around is World Poetry, Catherine Washburn. This is a big fat anthology that came out 20 years ago, more than that. When did this come out? It's a very unusual poetry anthology. 1998. This came out in 1998. It's a very unusual poetry anthology in that it is 90% translations. When it says world poetry, it does not mean that in addition to U.S. poems, you're going to get a few from France. It means Mongolia and Hawaii and ancient Persia. It's a weird anthology in that way and very, very eye-opening. But one of the little informal rules that I kind of want to do for our daily poetry reading is no poetry in translation. There's more than enough to read without that in my own native language. So we're going to go today to a fun poem. It's not actually fun. It's very grim, but it's going to be fun to talk about. This is called Affliction, and it's by Sir John Davies, who the anthology here tells me lived from 1569 to 1626. This is called Affliction. If aught can teach us aught, affliction's looks, making us look into ourselves so near, teach us to know ourselves beyond all books, or all the learned schools that ever were. This mistress lately plucked me by the ear. Mistress being affliction. Affliction's looks. Affliction with a capital A is what we're talking about. Mistress is going to come up. This mistress lately plucked me by the ear, and many a golden lesson hath me taught, hath made my senses quick and reason clear, reformed my will, and rectified my thought. So do the winds and thunders cleanse the air, so working seas settle and purge the wine, so lopped and pruned trees do flourish fair, so doth the fire the drossy gold refine. Neither Minerva nor the learned muse, nor rules of art, nor precepts of the wise, could in my brain those beams of skill infuse, as but the glance of this dame's angry eyes. She within my list my ranging mind hath brought, that now beyond myself I list not go. Myself am centre of my circling thought, only myself I study, learn, and know. I know my body's of so frail a kind, as force without, fevers within, can kill. I know the heavenly nature of my mind, but 'tis corrupted both in wit and will. I know my soul hath power to know all things, yet is she blind and ignorant in all. I know I am one of nature's little kings, yet to the least and vilest things am thrall. I know my life's a pain and but a span. I know my sense is mocked with everything. And to conclude, I know myself a man, which is a proud and yet a wretched thing. And that is John Davies. That is John Davies writing about gas. Now, it's a little bit disillusioning to think that, but nevertheless, it's true. John Davies was an extremely famous literary figure, a poet in his day. He was a favorite poet of both Queen Elizabeth I and her successor, King James. They both thought his poetry was better than just about any poetry that they'd heard. And he had a string of official positions and emoluments and whatnot, made a good living, came from a fairly good family, got a good education, and made a good living. But he was a big, thick-headed, no-necked thug. A big, burly, bare-knuckled, brutish thug who only managed in the intellectual realms of poetry because in the Elizabethan era, there wasn't yet this weird artificial distinction that if you could write a really good line of poetry, you probably weren't any good at cracking heads. That distinction came much later. That was not true in Elizabethan times. In Elizabethan times, it was just another thing that a big no-neck thug was expected to be able to do well. And John Davies did it really well. He is a really, really good poet. You wouldn't know it because there's been no popular edition of his poetry in any time recently that I can think of. Penguin has never done him, as far as I know. He's never had a biography, even though we have tons and tons of documents of his life, first-hand documents of his life, and he led a fascinating life. He lived and moved and breathed and had his being in the upper rungs of the cutthroat Elizabethan court politics world. It would make for a fascinating book. It wouldn't be a very cheery book because he was a thug. He was a brute. His first response when someone disagreed with him was to punch them or to beat them with a wagon stave or something like that, and just skirt just barely north of the law as a result. And he was also no friend of Ireland, I should say. He spent a lot of time, as so many courtiers in the Elizabethan court did. He spent a lot of time seeing how well he could put the thumbscrews to Ireland to corkscrew money out of it. But I'm not necessarily saying that he was a savory character. He should still have biographies, at least 5 or 6 of them, and he doesn't have any. He should still have annotated big volumes of his poetry, and as far as I know, he doesn't have any. Certainly none for popular consumption. But even though he was a brute and a horrible person, and in his life, when he was alive, he got some recompense for that. You don't like to see the wicked prosper. For instance, he had one of the worst afflictions that can attach to anyone's life. He had a crazy wife. He couldn't get rid of her. She was well positioned at court herself, and also a popular author. So he couldn't get rid of her, but she was nuts, just completely barking at the moon nuts. And when it came time for serious deliberations in Star Chamber-like organizations to sift through a short list of candidates for this position or that position, that always came up. And you couldn't have seen that kind of frustration happen to a more deserving guy. Nevertheless, he did prosper throughout his life. And unlike in a just world, he would have been beaten to death in some slimy back alley in London, and that would have been the end of him. But instead, he went on to silk slippers and the wool sack, and finally an opulent deathbed in Englefield House. I don't know how many of you in the UK have ever been to Hampshire. Have you ever been to Englefield House? I have been to Englefield House many, many times. I have been in every inch of it, including the places where the tourists. I believe Englefield House, you can visit the grounds anyway, and maybe the smaller houses on the main estate. I don't know that tourists are allowed in the house itself, except for gala events. I think you can rent the thing, and God knows. Filming companies rent the thing, rent Englefield House, where Sir John Davies died. They rent the house where he died all the time. All the time. If you saw a picture of it, you would recognize it from half a dozen movies that you've seen. I spent some time there a long time ago. I had some, I don't know the adjective that would accurately describe the encounters. Let's just say I knew the father of the current owner of the house. In one capacity or another, I knew the father of the current owner of the house. So I know it well. And it's rotten as a place where a thug like this guy should turn up his toes, should pop his clogs. He deserved a different end, a worse end. But nevertheless, he doesn't need to be a good person to write great poetry. And this is a terrific poem. I may not have done it justice, but it's a terrific poem. And at the heart of the poem is the narrator of the poem, who in this case very much is Sir John Davies, saying, once affliction has taken you by the ear, your mind is clarified, and it stays that way. Once that happens, you suddenly know all of the stuff. You are transformed on the inside by having your priorities straightened in such a violent black and white way. How did it go? So do the winds and thunders cleanse the air. So working seas settle and purge the wine. That's for wine casks on a merchant vessel. So lopped and pruned trees do flourish fair. So doth the fire the drossy gold refine. This is absolutely true. a century later or so, Dr. Johnson would also say this. People have said this throughout the ages, that the proximity of, in this case, Dame Affliction, marvelously clarifies your mind. It puts your priorities in order, and if you're lucky, it keeps them there. I know this to be true. I know this firsthand, directly to be true, and there's nothing like it. There's nothing else that will do it. You sitting down and thinking through all of the tangles and the murkiness of your life, that'll do wonders, and you really should do that. Keep a journal. It will really help you to do that. But nothing does that quite like Dame Affliction. Like that moment when you suddenly have all of the markers put on the table and there's no one else. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go but that. Some of you may have experienced a small version of this if you have, for instance, heartburn or a really bad nightmare that lasts you all night long. You wake up in the morning, sunlight is flowing through the windows, suddenly it's all over and you feel better. You can suddenly feel a little gust of renewal. But this is much more than that. This is when you think you're going to die, when you're certain that you are. And in this particular case, it was gas. It was Sir John Davies having gas. Now, I'm not talking about flatulence here, much though I love to talk about flatulence. I'm talking about the real thing. Some of you will have experienced what I'm talking about. The real thing hurts like nothing that you can imagine. And it really does feel like you're going to die. Sir John Davies was not going to die. He suffered for 2 days. But that's an eternity when you can't get comfortable, when the pain is staggering, and when you can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't drink, you can't do anything. Then all of a sudden, it's gone. It reaches a critical mass in whatever open cavity it's in, and then dissipates. And of course, sometimes in the course of 15 minutes. You can feel it going away. But it doesn't change how it changed your mind when you're laying there and you're sure that you're never getting out of this bed again. That changes you. Now, in John Davies' case, it didn't change him for the better. It clarified his mind that he wanted to be even more of a ruthless a-hole than he had been before. It doesn't have to change you for the better. And it ended up not making a difference. He was a big, burly ox of a man. And big, burly oxen get fat. When they get older, they get fat. They don't lose that weight until they're dying. And he did, and eventually died just of well, I don't remember what the actual historical name for it was, but he had a heart attack, and it just killed him. I mean, it didn't kill him immediately. He lived for, I think, about 15 hours, but that's what it was, and you could have seen it coming a long time previous to when it happened, just from the way he lived and the way he ate and the way he drank and the way he was never content or peaceful at all, which led his crazy wife to say, I've had a vision that my husband is going to die. And she kept changing the date. She went around in mourning for him while he was alive for years. First she said it was 3 weeks. He was going to die in 3 weeks. You didn't take more than one look at him to know that he was not going to make old bones. It didn't take more than one look to know that when he died, he was going to die like a balloon popping. But she, like all fake prophets, she fixed a date and then fudged it and then fixed it again and then fudged it. And eventually, when he died at Englefield House, she said, "See, I was right." But it wasn't, angina. It wasn't a pre-coronary event that gave him the moment that gave rise to this poem. It was gas. And we got a great poem out of it. We got a great poem out of two unworthy sources. One, a horrible, mongrel, bare-knuckle, bald-headed brute of a guy. And two, intestinal gas. Those two things combined to give us a wonderful poem about how you really should seize on that. Now, the poem isn't actually telling you that. The poem is not advising you to live as though Dame Affliction had pulled you by the ear yourself. The poem is pretty much assuming that you will not have that internal change until that happens. And I can kind of agree with that. I can kind of second that. It does that change like nothing else does. Not anything that you can make happen yourself does that change. And I'm hoping that a lot of you never have that moment. It's not ultimately worth it, but the poem is very well dramatizing what that moment is like, what that change is like. The only 2 cent sort that I wanted to add in here is that it isn't necessarily always for the better, as we can see all throughout history, but Sir John Davies will do right now as an example. So that's your poem for today. A nice, lovely Sunday poem about the inevitability of death and the pain of intestinal gas. Aren't you glad you subscribed? But I'll be back. We'll do poetry again. Thank you, BookTube.